The silence in the observation chamber was a physical weight pressing down on Elian's shoulders. It was a manufactured silence, the kind that came from sound-dampening panels and triple-paned chromic glass, a sterile void where the only audible sound was the soft, rhythmic sigh of the air filtration system. It smelled of nothing, of purified, recycled oxygen, and the faint, antiseptic tang of the solution used to polish the white floors until they reflected the recessed lighting with a cold, unforgiving glare. He stood on a low dais in the center of the room, a specimen under a microscope. The formal presentation was over. The potential suitors, a curated selection of the consortium's highest-ranking alphas, had filed out, their expressions ranging from clinical interest to polite dispassion. Their sense had been a cacophony of power and privilege, musk and rare wood, sharp citrus and cold iron. But none had lingered. None had sought to claim the air around him. He was an asset, a curiosity, a stabilized Omega variant, reclaimed from the feral colonies and reconditioned for societal integration. That was the official terminology. In reality, he was a ghost, haunted by a past they had tried to erase and defined by a biology they coveted but did not understand. His own scent, the one he was trained to suppress to a near imperceptible whisper, was a storm held in a bottle. Ozone and petrichor, the smell of lightning striking dry earth just before a deluge. It was a wild, untamable thing, and they hated it as much as they desired its potential. The door hissed open, a sound that cut through the sterile quiet like a scalpel. Elian did not turn. He kept his gaze fixed on his own faint reflection in the darkened glass, a pale, slender silhouette against the void. He did not need to see or smell to know who had entered. The shift in atmospheric pressure was enough. The sudden, sharp dip in temperature, as if a pocket of cryo-frozen air had been released into the room. Kalen Volkov, heir to the Volkov Directorate and the most powerful alpha in the consortium, moved with a silence that was more profound than the room's engineered hush. It was the silence of a predator, absolute and confident. His scent followed him, a clean, glacial fragrance of frost-covered pine and winter air, a scent that promised stillness and death. It did not reach out, it simply existed, forcing the sterile air to bend to its will. Elian felt the fine hairs on his arms rise, a primal response he had been conditioned to ignore. He was not an animal. He was not a slave to instinct. The conditioning was a fragile shield, and Kalen's presence was a hammer poised to strike. "The council is pleased with your composure," Kalen said. His voice was a low baritone, devoid of inflection, as measured and controlled as the environment around them. It was a voice accustomed to giving orders and having them obeyed without question. "Dr. Thorne has exceeded expectations. Your feral instincts are remarkably well contained." Elian remained silent, his hands clasped loosely behind his back, his posture a study in trained submission. He had learned that words were a currency he could not afford to spend. Silence was his only armor, his only rebellion. He could feel Kalen's gaze on him, analytical and dismissive. He was being appraised, not as a potential mate, but as a piece of strategic hardware, a biological weapon whose loyalty and function had to be ascertained. The silence stretched, thin and taut, a wire vibrating with unspoken tension. Kalen took a slow step closer, and the cold intensified. Elian's breath hitched, a tiny, involuntary betrayal of his composure. He could feel the sheer, oppressive weight of the Alpha's presence, a gravitational pull that demanded acknowledgement, demanded surrender. They believe you are the key to stabilizing the Omega gene stock, Kalen continued, his voice still a detached monotone, a perfect synthesis of primal strength and conditioned obedience, a valuable asset. Asset. The word hung in the air, cold and sharp. He was not a person. He was a thing, a resource. He was not an asset. He was not an experiment. He was a boy who remembered the taste of real rain and the feeling of mud between his toes, memories they had tried to scrub from his mind with chemicals and hypnotic suggestion. The scent of ozone in his blood pulsed, a faint, rebellious thrum. He forced it down, locking it away behind walls of practiced apathy. Kalen circled him slowly, his polished boots making no sound on the floor. Elian felt like a statue in a gallery, being examined for flaws. The glacial scent was everywhere now, seeping into his clothes, his skin, a violation that felt more intimate than any touch. "Your scent," Kalen stated, stopping directly behind him. Elian could feel the heat radiating from the alpha's body, a stark contrast to the coldness of his scent. "It is disruptive, unrefined." The critique was delivered with the same emotional detachment as a mechanic diagnosing a faulty engine. It was not personal. It was a statement of fact, and that made it infinitely more cruel. Elian's jaw tightened. He held his breath, fighting the instinct to release the storm, to fill the room with the scent of wildness and defiance, to choke the alpha on the very thing he disdained. "The Council believes a bond with you would secure my position as Director General. It would be a symbol of the consortium's power, taming the wild, perfecting the flawed, a union of control and primal nature." Kalen's voice was closer now, a low murmur beside his ear. Elian flinched, a microscopic tremor that he was sure the alpha noticed. "They are sentimental fools. They speak of destiny, of biological imperatives. They see a legend, a prophecy fulfilled." He fell silent for a moment, and the weight of his presence seemed to double. Elian felt a strange, terrifying resonance begin to build deep within his bones, a hum that seemed to answer the cold stillness of the alpha. It was the nascent stirring of a bond, the thing the scientists had engineered him for, the connection he was supposed to crave above all else. It felt like being chained. "Let me be clear," Kalen said, his voice dropping to a near whisper, a blade of ice against Elian's skin. "You are a tool, a means to an end. Your biology is a political convenience, nothing more." Each word was a carefully placed stone, building a wall between them. Elian stared at his reflection, at the wide, dark eyes that looked back at him, and saw nothing but a hollow shell. This was the moment, the culmination of years of conditioning, of being told his only value lay in securing a powerful alpha. And the most powerful of them all was telling him he was worthless. There was a dark, bitter irony in it that almost made him want to laugh. He had been raised for this, shaped for this, and it was all a political game. He was a pawn. Kalen stepped back into his line of sight, his face a mask of aristocratic indifference. His eyes, the color of a winter sky, were cold and empty. They held no warmth, no desire, no anger, only a profound, soul-crushing control. He looked at Elian, truly looked at him, and delivered the final, killing blow. "You are nothing to me." The words were not shouted. They were not spoken with malice. They were stated as an immutable fact, as certain as gravity. They sliced through the conditioning, through the years of hope and fear, and struck Elian's very core. The nascent hum of the bond inside him fractured, shattering into a million pieces of icy dust. A pain, sharp and breathtaking, lanced through his chest, a physical agony that stole the air from his lungs. He did not gasp, he did not cry out, he simply absorbed it, letting the pain become another layer of the silence that defined his existence. He met Kaelin's gaze in the reflection, his own expression unreadable. He gave the Alpha nothing. If he was nothing, then he would be nothing, a perfect, empty vessel. Kaelin held his gaze for a moment longer, a flicker of something unidentifiable in the depths of his cold eyes, annoyance, curiosity. And then he turned and walked away. The door hissed shut behind him, and the silence, heavier now, freighted with the weight of his declaration, settled back into place. Elian stood on the dais, a statue of a boy, surrounded by the lingering phantom cold of the Alpha who had claimed him and discarded him in the same breath. He was nothing, and in that nothingness, a tiny, dangerous seed of an idea began to take root. If he was nothing to the consortium's heir, then he owed him nothing. He owed this system nothing. And a person with nothing to lose is, in their own way, finally free. The scent of ozone, faint and sharp, began to leak through the cracks in his control, a promise of a storm to come. The days that followed bled into one another, a seamless expanse of white walls and scheduled intervals, sustenance cycles, physiological monitoring, cognitive recalibration sessions. Elian moved through the routine like a phantom, his body performing the required actions while his mind remained a distant, silent observer. The gilded cage of his suite, with its panoramic view of the sterile, arcology-dotted cityscape, felt more like a tomb than a home. The air was always the same temperature. The light was always the same muted, artificial luminescence. He was a biospecimen in a perfectly controlled terrarium, and the glass was suffocatingly close. The pain from Kaelin's rejection had subsided from a sharp, acute agony to a dull, persistent ache deep in his sternum. It was a cold spot, a void where the bond should have been. Sometimes, in the dead of the long, artificially mandated night, he would feel a phantom echo of it, a whisper of frost against his senses, a fleeting sense of being watched by cold, distant eyes. It was a ghost limb, a connection severed, yet still screaming its absence. He was nothing to Kaelin Volkov, but the Alpha's ghost was now a permanent resident in his soul. Dr. Aris Thorne was a constant presence, a clinical shadow in a pristine white coat. He was a man whose fascination with Elian's biology was matched only by his complete disregard for Elian's humanity. He would monitor the readouts from the sensors embedded in Elian's skin, his thin lips pursed in concentration, his eyes alight with intellectual curiosity. "The resonance cascade has stabilized," Thorne commented one morning, his gaze fixed on a holographic display that shimmered in the air between them. It showed a complex, spiraling waveform representing Elian's neurological and hormonal state. The Alpha's declarative rejection initiated a biofeedback loop. Most Omegas would have gone into systemic shock, catatonia. You, however, you have compartmentalized the trauma. Fascinating. Elian sat on the edge of the diagnostic bed, his hands resting in his lap, his expression placid. He did not offer a response. He was a subject of study. His pain was data. "The air is a fool," Thorne continued, almost to himself, a rare crack in his professional veneer. "He sees a political tool and fails to recognize the unprecedented biological potential. the strength of your genetic markers, your adaptability. A bond with you would have created a lineage of alphas, the likes of which this consortium has never seen. He has squandered a miracle of science out of sheer arrogance. A miracle of science. That's what he was. Not a boy who'd been found huddled in the ruins of a fallen settlement, clutching a faded photograph of a woman he could barely remember. Not a survivor. He was an experiment. They had taken the raw, volatile material of his feral Omega nature and tried to refine it, to temper it into a weapon for their own advancement. They had suppressed his heats with invasive hormonal treatments, rewired his neural pathways to obey, and then, when they needed him to be desirable, they had forcibly reawakened his primary biology with a brutal regimen of drugs and electro-stimulation. The memory of that reawakening was a black hole in his mind, a vortex of pain, confusion, and overwhelming sensory input he could never fully escape. He remembered the first time his own scent had bloomed, uncontrolled, filling the lab with the smell of a thunderstorm, causing the delicate senses to short out and the doctors to recoil. They had called it a success. He had called it a violation. Thorn deactivated the hologram and turned his pale, analytical eyes on Ilian. He may have rejected you verbally, but the initial resonance was established. A foundational link exists, however fractured. He will feel your emotional states, albeit as a muted echo. And you, I suspect, will feel his. Do you? Ilian met the doctor's gaze and gave a slow, deliberate shake of his head. It was a lie. He felt Kalen constantly. A low, persistent hum of cold ambition, a sharp spike of irritation during a council meeting, a deep, unsettling stillness during his meditative states. It was an invasion, a constant reminder of the man who considered him nothing. The lie was a small act of defiance, but it was his. It was a piece of himself he kept hidden from their senses and their prying eyes. It was in this hidden space that the seed of his idea was beginning to sprout, the idea of leaving. It was an impossible, ludicrous thought. The facility was a fortress buried deep within the consortium's central command. His every move was tracked, his biometrics constantly streamed to a central server. But the word impossible had lost its meaning. He had survived the wilds. He had survived their reconditioning. He would survive this. He began to watch, to listen. He stopped being a passive object and became a quiet observer of his own imprisonment. He noted the shift changes of the beta orderlies who brought his meals. He memorized the patrol patterns of the alpha guards in the corridors, their movements precise and predictable. He studied the schematics of the ventilation system displayed on a service panel left open by a careless technician. He learned the language of the facility's routine, its rhythms, its tiny exploitable imperfections. His mind, once a repository for conditioned responses, became a map of his cage. He was methodical, patient. He had nothing but time. The dull ache in his chest became a metronome, counting down the seconds to a future he would have to build for himself. The ghost of Kalen's presence was a spur, a constant reminder of what he was running from. He was not running from the alpha. He was running from the state of being nothing. He would go somewhere where he could simply be. Ilian. Just Ilian. The thought was so foreign, so breathtakingly audacious, that it felt more real than the sterile white walls around him. Hope, he discovered, was a quiet, clinical thing. It was the process of gathering data, of formulating a hypothesis, preparing to execute an experiment of his own. The subject was his freedom. The only acceptable outcome was success. Kalen Volkov stood on the observation deck of the Directorate Tower, the sprawling, neon-lit geometry of the consortium's capital city spread out below him like a circuit board. The city was a monument to order, to control. Every transport moved in a synchronized, flowing pattern. Every building was placed for maximum efficiency. Every citizen had a designated function. It was the system his father had built, the system he was destined to inherit. And it felt like a cage made of light and steel. His reflection stared back at him from the armored glass, a tall, severe figure in a dark, high-collared uniform. His face was a mask of composed authority, the face the council saw, the face his rivals feared. But behind the mask, a dissonant chord was playing, a low, persistent hum of something he refused to name. It had started the day he had dismissed the Omega, the asset. Eleon, the name came unbidden to his mind, a soft, unwelcome syllable. He had done what was necessary. He had demonstrated that he was not ruled by the base instincts that the council, in their romantic foolishness, believed were a source of strength. An alpha's power came from control, control of his territory, control of his subordinates, and most importantly, control of himself. A bond, especially one with a creature as volatile and unrefined as the feral Omega, was a liability, a weakness waiting to be exploited. He had severed the threat before it could form. Yet, it was not severed. The rejection had been a public declaration, a political statement, but it had not silenced the quiet, insistent resonance that had sparked to life the moment he had entered that observation chamber. He could still smell it, the ghost of that strange, disruptive scent. Ozone and rain. It clung to the back of his mind, a sensory anomaly in his perfectly ordered world. He found himself distracted in meetings, his attention drifting from quarterly production quotas and territorial disputes. He would feel a sudden, inexplicable wave of profound stillness, of deep, meditative calm, and would know somehow that it was not his own. It was an echo, a signal from a distant transmitter. It was the Omega. He had tasked his intelligence division with compiling a complete dossier on Asset 734. The official designation felt safer, more detached. He read the reports in the privacy of his office, the cool blue light of the datapad illuminating his face. He learned of the raid on the feral colony, of the child found hiding in a collapsed cellar. He saw the grainy images of a small, wild-eyed boy with dirt on his face and defiance in his eyes. He read Thorne's clinical notes detailing the brutal reconditioning process, the suppression of identity, the artificial reconstruction of a personality designed for submission. He saw the data on the Omega's unexpected resilience, his high tolerance for pain, his capacity for deep psychological compartmentalization. He was not just an asset, he was a survivor. The knowledge was unsettling. It added a layer of complexity to what should have been a simple political calculation. He had dismissed a tool, not a person who had endured a crucible and emerged whole, changed, but whole. The thought was a crack in the icy armor of his logic. He began to feel other echoes, a faint, sharp spike of something that felt like hope. It was absurd. The asset was in a secure, monitored environment. It had no reason for hope. It had no future beyond what the consortium decreed. The feeling was illogical, and Kalen despised illogical things. He pushed it aside, burying himself in his work, in the cold, hard data of running the directorate. He oversaw trade negotiations with the outer sectors, reviewed military deployments along the contested borderlands, and methodically dismantled a corporate espionage ring within his own ranks. He was the perfect heir, calm, calculating, efficient. But the ghost remained. In the sterile silence of his private quarters, he would sometimes close his eyes and find himself standing in that white observation room again. He would see the slender figure on the dais, the quiet defiance in his posture, the dark, unreadable eyes in the reflection. "You are nothing to me." He had spoken the words to assert his dominance, to define the terms of their non-relationship. He had expected the Omega to break, to show fear or despair. Instead, he had simply absorbed it. He had shown nothing. And his nothingness was a mirror, reflecting Kalen's own hollowness back at him. The dissonance grew louder, a persistent hum beneath the surface of his control. He was Kalen Volkov, the heir to the system. He was in command of everything. And yet, he was haunted by the ghost of a boy he had declared to be nothing. It was a paradox, a flaw in his perfect equation, and he found, to his profound and growing irritation, that he could not stop trying to solve it. Elian's world had shrunk to the space of a single breath held in anticipation. The plan, once an abstract concept, a fragile hope, had crystallized into a series of precise, calculated actions. It lived in the silent spaces of his mind, a secret garden he tended with meticulous care. He had found his key, his opportunity, in the system's own rigid predictability. Every third cycle, at precisely 200 hours, the corridor outside his suite underwent a routine atmospheric purge and sterilization sequence. For a period of 17 seconds, all electronic surveillance, visual, auditory, and biometric, was deactivated to prevent data corruption from the ionic cleansing field. 17 seconds. A lifetime. The door to his suite was mag-locked, impenetrable, but the small service panel near the floor, the one for the nutrient dispenser, had a manual release latch on the inside. A beta technician, weary at the end of a long shift, had once failed to secure it properly. Elian had watched, his heart a silent drum, as the man simply pressed the cover back into place without engaging the lock. He had checked it every day since, a secret ritual. It remained unlocked. From there, a narrow service conduit, just wide enough for him to crawl through, ran parallel to the main corridor. It was a path for maintenance drones, dark and dusty, a forgotten artery within the pristine body of the facility. He had acquired his tools with the patience of a predator, a small, reflective shard of polymer from a broken nutrient container, perfect for checking corners without exposing himself. A single protein bar, saved from his daily allotment for energy. His most important tool, however, was his own body. He had spent weeks practicing, moving silently in his room, controlling his breathing, lowering his heart rate to a near meditative state. He was conditioning himself for stealth, turning his body into an instrument of his own liberation. The ache in his chest was a constant companion, a cold anchor. But now it was twinned with a new sensation, a sharp, humming anticipation. The ghost of Kalen's presence was still there, a distant pressure at the edge of his consciousness. He worried that the alpha might feel the spike in his determination, the focused energy of his intent. He learned to shield his thoughts, to bury his hope under layers of feigned placidity, wrapping his mind in the same grey numbness he had worn for years. It was a suffocating, lonely process. He was hiding not just from his captors, but from the man who was psychically tethered to him. The night he chose was moonless, a fact he knew only from the astronomical data displayed on his suite's info panel. Not that it mattered, deep in the earth-scarred bowels of the consortium. The air was still, the artificial lights dimmed for the mandated sleep cycle. Elian stood in the center of his room, his bare feet cold against the floor. He closed his eyes, taking one last deep breath of the recycled air. He let the scent of ozone rise within him, not as a storm, but as a quiet, electric charge. It was the scent of his own being, the part of him they had never truly tamed. It was the scent of freedom. The chronometer on the wall ticked past Wu 159. His heart began to beat faster, a frantic bird against his ribs. He forced it down, drawing on his training, on the deep wells of his own resilience. Calm, silent, invisible. He moved to the wall, his fingers finding the seam of the service panel. He pressed, and it swung open with a soft click that sounded like a thunderclap in the silence. He peered into the darkness of the conduit. It smelled of dust and dormant machinery. The moment was here. He slipped the protein bar into the waistband of his simple grey tunic and slid into the opening, pulling the panel closed behind him. The darkness was absolute, a thick, velvety blackness that swallowed all light. He was entombed. For a terrifying second, panic seized him, the enclosed space pressing in, stealing his breath. He fought it back, his fingers gripping the cold metal of the conduit. This was not a tomb. This was the way out. He began to crawl, his movements slow and deliberate, the sound of his own breathing unnaturally loud in the confined space. The 17-second window was for the corridor outside. In here, he was blind to the facility's schedule. He could only trust his memory, his timing. He moved through the arteries of the beast, a virus in its system, a ghost in its machine. And for the first time in years, the cold ache in his chest was overshadowed by the fierce, blazing heat of his own will. He was no longer nothing. He was a countdown. Kaelin was in the middle of a holographic conference with the sector chiefs of the Outer Rim, a tense negotiation over resource allocation and defense protocols when the feeling hit him. It was not a thought or an echo. It was a sudden, violent severance, like a cable under immense tension snapping, a profound, gut-wrenching lurch of vertigo. He stopped mid-sentence, his hand gripping the edge of the polished obsidian table to steady himself. The sector chiefs on the shimmering displays looked at him in confusion. "Director Heir," one of them asked, his voice tinny through the speakers. Kaelin raised a hand, silencing him. He closed his eyes, trying to pinpoint the source of the disturbance, the low, persistent hum that had become the background radiation of his existence, the psychic link to the Omega. It was gone, not faded, but violently excised. The space it had occupied in his mind was now a screaming void, a wound-bleeding silence. It was a silence more deafening than any sound. It was the silence of absence, of loss. "This meeting is concluded," Kaelin said, his voice dangerously low. He terminated the conference with a sharp gesture, the holographic figures vanishing into pixels. He stood alone in the vast, silent room, the city lights twinkling beyond the glass. The silence in his mind was absolute. For the first time in weeks, he felt truly alone, and the feeling was unbearable. He had told himself the connection was a nuisance, a liability. He had prided himself on ignoring it, on proving his immunity to its pull. Now, in its absence, he felt amputated. The realization struck him with the force of a physical blow. The link had not been a chain, It had been an anchor, a strange, unwelcome tether to something real in his world of sterile artifice. He had been so focused on the logic of control that he had failed to understand the nature of the connection. It was not merely biological, it was deeper, more fundamental. And now, it was gone. He strode from the conference room, his long coat swirling behind him. His personal guard snapped to attention as he passed, their faces impassive. He ignored them. He moved with a speed and purpose that bordered on predatory, his mind racing. A severance like that could mean only one thing. The asset was dead. The thought sent a jolt of something cold and sharp through him, something that felt terrifyingly like grief. But that was illogical. He felt no grief for a faulty piece of equipment. He stormed into the central monitoring hub, a cavernous room filled with technicians and glowing screens displaying data streams from every corner of the directorate. "Status report on Asset 734, he commanded, his voice cutting through the low hum of the servers. The hub supervisor, a harried-looking beta, scrambled to his station. His fingers flew across the console. A moment later, his face went pale. "Sir, there's an anomaly." "Report," Kalen bit out, his patience worn to a thread. "All biometric signals for Asset 734 ceased at 0204 hours. We registered it as a critical life support failure. A medical team was dispatched to his quarters." "And?" Kalen demanded, stepping closer, his shadow falling over the console. The supervisor swallowed hard. "Sir, the quarters are empty. The asset is gone." The words hung in the air. Gone. Not dead. Gone. The sudden, violent severance hadn't been death. It had been distance. The Omega had somehow gotten far enough away, broken through the facility's deep-level shielding to sever the psychic link. The cold feeling in Kalen's gut was not grief. It was fury, a pure, glacial rage that burned colder than any fire. He had been deceived. He had been made a fool of. The quiet, submissive Omega, the stabilized asset, the creature of contained, feral instincts, had played them all. The stillness he had felt from the Omega, the placid calm. It hadn't been submission. It had been the deep, controlled focus of a hunter, a planner. While he had been dismissing the Omega as nothing, the Omega had been studying him, studying his entire system, and had found a way out. Kalen felt a slow, dangerous smile touch his lips. It was a chilling expression, devoid of any warmth. The paradox was solved. The anomaly was explained. The asset was not just a survivor. He was a strategist. He was intelligent. He was defiant. And he was Kalen's. That thought slammed into his mind with the force of absolute, undeniable truth. He had rejected the bond, but the bond had been forged nonetheless. He had declared the Omega nothing, but his absence had just proven he was everything. "Lock down the city," Kalen said, his voice soft, yet carrying to every corner of the silent room. "Seal every exit point. Ground all transports. I want every security unit, every patrol, every surveillance drone dedicated to one task: finding him." The supervisor stared at him, aghast. "Sir, an entire city locked down for one missing Omega. The council does not need to approve," Kalen interrupted, his winter sky eyes locking onto the man's. "Asset 734 is a piece of proprietary consortium technology, a biological weapon of immense value. His disappearance is not a simple escape. It is an act of industrial espionage. He has been stolen by our enemies." He was lying, but it was a lie that would move mountains. It was a lie that would give him the full, terrifying power of the consortium's military and intelligence apparatus to hunt down one runaway boy. "Find him," Kalen repeated, the words resonating with the cold, hard certainty of a death sentence. "Find him and bring him back to me, unharmed. I want him alive." He turned and swept from the room, leaving a trail of stunned silence and cold fear in his wake. The hunt had begun, and Kalen Volkov would tear his entire world apart to get back what was his. The first breath of real air was a shock to the system. It was cold, wet, and thick with smells Elian had almost forgotten. Damp earth, decaying leaves, the metallic tang of rain on pavement. It was a chaotic, overwhelming symphony of a sensation after years of sterile, filtered oxygen. He stood in the mouth of a storm drain, rain plastering his thin grey tunic to his skin, shivering not just from the cold, but from the sheer, terrifying thrill of it. He had made it. He had crawled for what felt like hours through the labyrinthine service conduits, following the schematics he had memorized, his only guide, the faint hum of machinery and the subtle changes in air pressure. He had emerged into a sub-level maintenance hangar, slipped past a pair of distracted beta mechanics, and found his way to the city's underbelly, the massive storm drainage system that was one of the few parts of the arcology not constantly monitored for biosignatures. He was out. He was free. The city's lockdown sirens began to wail almost immediately, their mournful, rising cry echoing through the cavernous drain pipes. Flashing red and blue lights began to strobe against the rain-slicked walls of the distant cityscape. They knew. Kalen knew. Panic, cold and sharp, tried to claw its way up his throat. He was one boy, on foot, with no resources, against the entire security apparatus of the consortium. His escape felt less like a victory and more like the beginning of a death sentence. He pushed the fear down. He had planned for this. He pulled the hood of a discarded worker's poncho he had found over his head and melted into the shadows of the Undercity, a sprawling, neglected warren of forgotten streets and derelict structures that existed beneath the gleaming towers. He moved through the perpetual twilight, just another shadow among many. For 2 days, he was a ghost. He survived on the protein bar and scavenged water. He slept in the hollowed-out shell of a decommissioned transport vehicle, the sound of rain drumming on the metal roof a constant lullaby. The absence of the psychic link to Kalen was a hollow ache, a constant void. But it was a clean wound, a liberating emptiness. He was finally, blessedly alone in his own head. He was no one's asset, no one's experiment. He was just Elian, a boy trying to survive. He knew he couldn't stay in the capital. It was the heart of the beast, and it would be searched with surgical precision. He needed to get to the borderlands, the contested territories where the consortium's authority was thin and a person could disappear. He stowed away on a cargo transport hauling industrial waste to the reclamation sectors, hiding in a compartment that smelled of chemical solvents and rust. The journey was suffocating and miserable, but with every kilometer, the transport carried him away from the capital. The air in his lungs felt lighter. He finally emerged in a grimy, rain-swept outpost town on the edge of consortium space. The town, called Rustfall, was a chaotic jumble of prefabricated buildings and repurposed shipping containers, all stained with the perpetual reddish-brown grime that gave the place its name. It was populated by contract miners, smugglers, and people who, like him, had reasons to live in the shadows. Here, his simple grey tunic and haunted eyes didn't draw a second glance. He was just another piece of human detritus washed up on the shores of civilization. He found work hauling scrap for a gruff beta woman who ran a salvage yard. She paid him in ration chips and didn't ask questions. For the first time, he was earning his own keep. The labor was back-breaking, his muscles screaming in protest, but the physical pain was grounding. It was real. It was his. He thought he was safe. He had believed that by severing the link, by putting physical distance between them, he had escaped Kalen's reach. He was wrong. One evening, as he was sitting on the roof of his small rented hovel, a modified storage container, watching the twin suns set over the blasted landscape, it returned. It wasn't the constant, low-level hum of before. It was a targeted, focused pulse of ice-cold energy that slammed into his mind with the force of a battering ram. He cried out, clutching his head as a wave of nausea and vertigo washed over him. It was Kalen, but this was different. It wasn't a passive connection. This was active. He was being hunted. Through the link, he could feel the Alpha's singular, obsessive focus, a cold, relentless rage that was aimed directly at him. He could feel the vast network of intelligence Kalen was using, spreading out like a spider's web, and he was the fly it was designed to catch. The ghost that had haunted him in the lab was now a hunter on his trail. He could feel Kalen's frustration at every dead end, his cold satisfaction at every new lead. He wasn't just a missing asset anymore. This was personal. The realization was terrifying. Kalen wasn't trying to reclaim a piece of property. He was trying to reclaim a part of himself that had been torn away. The man who had declared him nothing was now spending the full might of his directorate to find him, driven by an instinct he had claimed to be above. The irony was so bitter, it tasted like ash. Elian understood now. He could run to the farthest corner of the galaxy, and it wouldn't matter. The bond, fractured and rejected, was still there. It was a leash, and Kalen was now pulling on it, reeling him in. He was not free. He had only exchanged one cage for another, larger one. The despair was a physical weight, threatening to crush the fragile hope he had nurtured. He looked out at the endless, rust-colored wasteland, and for the first time since his escape, he felt truly, completely trapped. He could feel Kalen getting closer, the psychic pressure increasing with each passing day, a storm front moving in, promising a reckoning. He could not escape. The hunt was no longer just a search. It had become an obsession. The search for Asset 734 had consumed Kalen Volkov. His duties as heir, the political maneuvering, the economic oversight, it all faded into the background, noise to be managed by his subordinates. His world had narrowed to a single, sharp point of focus, the recovery of the escaped Omega. He had used the cover story of corporate espionage to justify his unprecedented mobilization of consortium resources. Every intelligence agent, every surveillance drone, every provincial garrison was now part of his private hunting party. He moved his command center to the flagship of the Directorate's fleet, the Stalwart, a vessel of imposing, brutalist design. From its bridge, surrounded by holographic displays showing troop movements and intelligence intercepts, he directed the search with a cold, terrifying efficiency. He slept little, ate less. He was sustained by a cold fire of purpose he had never known before. He was hunting. The initial severing of their bond had been disorienting, but he had quickly learned that it was not absolute. It was a matter of distance and interference, a flaw. He had his top scientists, under the direct supervision of a bewildered Dr. Thorne, work around the clock to amplify his own neurological output, to turn the faint, passive resonance of the bond into a targeted signal. They had created a device, a sort of psychic amplifier that integrated with the ship's command throne, that allowed him to ping the bond, to send out focused pulses of his own energy, searching for a response. For weeks, there was nothing but silence. He cast his net wider, following every rumored sighting, every whisper of a feral Omega with strange, dark eyes. He tracked stowaways on cargo freighters, raided black market operations in the outer sectors, and interrogated smugglers and information brokers. He was relentless. He felt his operatives' frustrations, their dead ends, as if they were his own. The Omega had vanished, as if he had never existed. The council was growing restless, questioning the exorbitant cost of his obsession. His rivals were beginning to whisper, sensing a weakness, an emotional imbalance in the famously controlled Heir. He ignored them all. He did not care about the cost. He did not care about the whispers. He would have what was his. Then, one cycle, as he sat on the command throne, the amplifier humming around him, he felt it, a faint, distant echo, a flicker of resonance in the vast, empty darkness. It was so faint he almost missed it, a tiny, almost imperceptible response to his psychic pulse. But it was there. It was alien. A wave of cold, possessive triumph washed over him, so potent it was almost dizzying. He had him. He focused his energy, pushing more power through the amplifier, strengthening the connection. The echo grew stronger, and with it came a flood of sensory data. Not images, but feelings. The grit of sand, the taste of metallic dust, the weariness of hard labor, the profound, aching loneliness of a soul adrift. And beneath it all, a simmering, defiant core of resilience. He had the Omega's emotional location, a psychic fingerprint. He cross-referenced the feeling with the geographical data of the sector. The desolation, the industrial decay. It pointed to the borderlands, specifically the Rustfall territories. He had found him. Set a course for the Rustfall sector, he commanded, his voice resonating with a new, dangerous authority. Full burn. I want every available ground unit to converge on the primary settlement. Establish a perimeter. No one gets in or out. Dr. Thorne, who had been observing from the edge of the bridge, stepped forward, his expression a mixture of scientific awe and human concern. Herr Volkov, he began, his voice hesitant. The subject's emotional state is fragile. The force you are projecting through the bond could cause severe neurological damage to both of you. Kalen turned his head slowly, his icy gaze pinning the doctor in place. My tolerance for neurological damage is considerably higher than yours, Doctor. Do not question my methods. Thorne paled and retreated. Kalen turned his attention back to the swirling star charts on the main view screen. He could feel alien now, a bright, defiant spark in the darkness. He could feel the Omega's terror as he realized he had been found, the sudden, desperate surge of his will to flee. It was intoxicating. During the journey to Rustfall, Kalen did something he had never done before. He opened himself to the bond, not as a tool to hunt, but as a conduit. He let the Omega's memories, his feelings, bleed into him. He felt the cold terror of the reconditioning labs. He felt the sting of public humiliation in the observation chamber. He felt the dull, constant ache of the rejection. He felt the desperate, blazing hope of the escape. He was experiencing Elian's life, his pain, his defiance from the inside. The experience was transformative. The cold, logical construct of Kalen Volkov, the perfect heir, began to fracture. The rage that had driven him was slowly being replaced by something far more complex, something he could not name. It was a hollow ache in his own chest that mirrored the one he felt in Elian. He had been the cause of this pain. He, who prided himself on order and precision, had acted with the careless cruelty of a spoiled child, breaking something precious simply to prove that he could. He had told Elian he was nothing, but he was now seeing that the Omega was a creature of impossible strength and will. He had survived the wilds, he had survived the consortium's torturous science, and he had survived Kalen's own callous dismissal. The hunt was no longer about reclaiming an asset. It was no longer about assuaging a bruised ego. He didn't know what it was about anymore. He only knew that the screaming void inside him, the one created when Elian had vanished, would only be filled when he saw him again. He had to see him. He had to fix it. The thought was alien. Kalen Volkov did not fix mistakes. He erased them. But this mistake was now a part of him. As the stalwart dropped out of hyperspace into the rust-colored skies of Rustfall, Kalen knew this was more than a recovery mission. It was a confrontation with himself. The sky above Rustfall turned a bruised purple, torn open by the violent re-entry flare of the consortium fleet. The ground trembled as the massive ships settled into low orbit, their shadows falling over the grimy town like the hand of a wrathful god. It was over. Elian stood frozen in the salvage yard, a piece of rusted metal clutched in his hand. He didn't need to see the ships to know who had come for him. He could feel Kalen's presence like a physical force, a focused, overwhelming pressure that made the air crackle and the fillings in his teeth ache. The psychic leash had been fully reeled in. There was nowhere left to run. People were screaming, running for cover as consortium dropships descended on the town, disgorging squads of black-clad soldiers who moved with terrifying, synchronized precision. They weren't searching. They were containing. They were building a cage around the entire town, and he was the creature trapped inside. He dropped the piece of metal with a clang and ran. Instinct took over, the old feral survival instinct that the doctors had tried so hard to burn out of him. He scrambled through the labyrinth of junk piles and narrow alleyways, his heart hammering against his ribs. He could feel Kalen's mind, a cold, focused point of light, tracking his every move. He was a mouse in a maze, and the scientist was watching from above. He found himself in the town's small, disused marketplace, a central plaza surrounded by makeshift stalls. The soldiers were closing in, their movements efficient, their voices emotionless as they gave orders over their comms. He was cornered. He backed away, his eyes darting around, looking for an escape that didn't exist. And then he saw him. Kalen Volkov descended from a personal transport, a sleek black craft that settled in the center of the plaza with a whisper of anti-gravity engines. He wore no armor, only the same severe, high-collared black uniform he had worn in the observation chamber. The wind whipped his dark coat around him, making him look like a figure from a dark fable. He was alone, having ordered his soldiers to hold their positions at the perimeter. This was not an arrest. This was a personal reckoning. Kalen's eyes, as cold and grey as a winter sky, scanned the plaza and found him instantly. Their gazes locked across the rain-slicked space. The psychic pressure intensified 100-fold, a direct, intimate connection that stripped away all defenses. In that moment, Elian could feel everything from the alpha, the obsessive drive of the hunt, the cold fury, but underneath it, something else, something new and terrifying, a profound, aching regret, a desperate, hollow need that mirrored his own. Kalen began to walk towards him, his steps slow and deliberate, the sound of his boots echoing in the sudden silence. The rain began to fall again, a gentle drizzle that soaked into Elian's tunic, plastering it to his thin frame. He stood his ground, trembling but defiant. He had run as far as he could. There was nothing left to do but face the storm. "Elian," Kalen said, his voice quiet but carrying easily across the plaza. It was the first time he had ever said his name. The sound of it from the Alpha's lips was both a violation and a strange sort of validation. He was not Asset 734. He was Elian. "You have caused a considerable amount of trouble," Kalen continued, his tone measured, formal, as if they were discussing a business transaction. He stopped a few feet away, close enough that Elian could feel the cold radiating from him, could smell the phantom scent of frost and pine. "I gave the order for a city-wide lockdown. I have deployed 2 sectors of the fleet. I have brought the trade negotiations with the outer colonies to a standstill. All for you." Elian said nothing. He just watched him, his dark eyes wide, his expression a mixture of fear and exhaustion. "I told the council you were stolen," Kalen said, his gaze unwavering. "A valuable piece of biological weaponry taken by our enemies. It was the only way to justify the expense of finding you." He took another step closer. The rain was falling harder now, running down their faces, blurring the lines of the world around them. "It was a lie, of course. You were not stolen. You left. Why?" The question, so simple, so direct, broke through Elian's shock. A bitter, humorless laugh escaped his lips. "Why?" he repeated, his voice hoarse. "You told me I was nothing, a tool, an asset. Tools don't have reasons. They just are, or they aren't. I chose not to be." Kalen's expression flickered, a crack in the icy mask. "That was a mistake, a miscalculation." "A miscalculation." Elian's voice rose, laced with a pain and fury he had suppressed for months. "You stood there in that white room and you shattered me. You looked at me like I was something you'd scrape off the bottom of your boot, and you call it a miscalculation." "Yes," Kalen said, his voice raw, stripped of its usual control. "Because I was wrong. I thought control was strength. I thought denying instinct, denying this connection, was the ultimate expression of power. I was a fool." He raised a hand, as if to reach out, then let it fall back to his side. "In your absence, I learned the truth. A system with a missing component is a broken system. I am a broken system, Elian." The confession hung in the air between them, more shocking than any threat. The great Kalen Volkov, the heir, the embodiment of control, was admitting to being broken, and Elian was the cause. The power dynamic had irrevocably, seismically shifted. Elian was no longer the specimen under the microscope. He was the flaw in the equation, the variable that had caused the entire system to collapse. "So you came here to what? Reclaim your missing component?" Elian asked, his voice laced with suspicion. "To put the tool back in its box?" "No," Kalen said, and the certainty in his voice was absolute. He took the final step, closing the distance between them. He was so close now that Elian could see the flecks of silver in his grey eyes, could see the genuine turmoil etched on his face. "I came here to ask you to come back." It was not a command. It was a plea, however stilted and unfamiliar it sounded on his tongue. "Nothing will be the same. You will not be an asset. You will not be a prisoner. You will have a position, a voice, your own authority." "Why?" Elian whispered, the single word encompassing a universe of doubt and pain. Kalen looked at him, and for the first time the mask of the Alpha Heir fell away completely. What was left was just a man, powerful and lost, finally confronting the truth he had tried so hard to deny. "Because you are not nothing to me," he said, his voice barely a whisper against the sound of the rain. "You are the only thing." The words, the opposite of the ones that had broken him, did not heal the wound. But they were a beginning. A fragile, tentative bridge across the chasm of pain and mistrust. Elian looked at the man before him, the man who had caused him so much pain, the man who had torn the galaxy apart to find him. He saw his hunter, his captor, his tormentor. And he saw a man who was just as chained by the bond as he was. He had a choice. He could turn his back, try to run again, and spend the rest of his life looking over his shoulder, forever hunted by this man and his own heart. Or he could take a different path. He could walk back into the cage, but this time he would hold the key. "On my terms," Elian said, his voice quiet but firm, a sliver of steel. "Everything. On my terms." Kalen looked down at him, the rain streaming down his face, and for the first time a genuine, uncalculated emotion showed in his eyes. It was relief, a profound, soul-deep relief. He gave a slow, formal nod. "On your terms." The soldiers remained at the perimeter, the ships hung silent in the sky. In the center of the rain-swept plaza, the Alpha and the Omega stood, not as master and asset, but as two fractured halves of a whole, finally ready to begin. The storm had passed, leaving a quiet, uncertain dawn in its wake.